IBS is to some extent in the medical world not really taken seriously. A lot of people with IBS, they also feel like the doctor is stabbing in the dark, or they're like, oh, we can't find anything else, so we'll give you this diagnosis. But actually, there is no specific marker, unfortunately, for IBS as a problem because it's a functional condition.
One of the most popularized dietary interventions is the low FODMAP diet.
And what they are is basically the different types of carbohydrates, and they end up going into your stomach, then into the small bowel, where some of them should be digested, but in IBS they're not. Really what we want to do is identify if you're actually intolerant to any of them.
Someone could realistically be on a low FODMAP diet for their whole life.
But there is actually research to show there is a negative impact on the microbiome because a lot of these foods, they're fermentable carbohydrates, which means that they're feeding your microbes.
And I just wonder if that dietary change over decades has also been somewhat linked to an increased incidence in gut symptoms, IBS and things like that.
And I think that's the problem with the gut, is that
Today's guest is Kirsten Jackson, the IBS dietitian. She's the author of Take Control of Your IBS, and as someone who suffered from the condition herself, she knows exactly what it's like to feel the cramps, the bloating, the constipation, and how to get rid of it. And if you want to learn more about your gut, the microbiome, with practical tips, you can order my book, This is Vital Information, and the links are in the description below. Now, before we get started, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the podcast. It's a massive help in helping us reach even more people. Thank you very much. Now, on to Kirsten. Kirsten, welcome to the podcast. I really wanted to get deep into the topic of Irritable Bowel Syndrome, IBS, because there's a lot of misinformation about IBS. And I think even people with IBS, they often themselves don't fully understand what IBS is because they've not been educated on it. And again, the misinformation that they hear and read online can actually worsen their own health outcomes because they listen to a certain type of diet that someone's talking about, or they take a certain supplement that someone's talking about. But even boiling it down to the root condition itself, it's not a gut condition, it's not a brain condition, it's both. There's a software and hardware issue going on. So, in the simplest possible way, what exactly is IBS?
So with IBS, I think a lot of people feel like it's not even a real condition because it's so difficult to actually pinpoint definition. But in the most simplest terms, it's a disorder of the gut-brain axis. So you've got your brain and your gut. They should be talking to each other back and forth really nicely to get the body functioning. And there's lots of pathways between that unfortunately, when you get IBS, they just don't work. So it's not a one thing, it's lots of pathways. And that just means that if your brain is doing one thing, then your gut is not behaving essentially, and vice versa as well.
So if we're looking at a communication problem between the gut and brain, there's lots of routes via which the gut and brain contact and connect with each other. One is obviously the vagus nerve, but an underappreciated route of communication between the gut and brain is through the microbiome. So I think I'd be remiss in not mentioning the microbiome as potentially a huge contributor to IBS, given that we don't quite have a specific cause that we can point out and say, hey, it's because of this. It stands to reason that the microbiome may contribute to IBS symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. The microbiome definitely will play a role. I think that's where we kind of end up being a bit like, what role? But we know some things from research straight away. So for instance, if we compare the microbiome of somebody who's got IBS versus somebody who hasn't, we know that there are differences. So somebody with IBS will have lower levels of like lactobacillus and also bifidobacterium. So there's definitely differences there. But where we get then stumped is like, well, how do we target those specifically? And of course, we know, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, later, that probiotics can help somebody with IBS. So there is a huge microbiome element there.
So we still don't have a conclusive, one-size-fits-all diagnostic test, scan, or blood test for irritable bowel syndrome, not least exploring the different subtypes of IBS, which we'll no doubt come on to. Given that, it's often been pretty dogmatic thinking in the clinical world that IBS is a diagnosis of exclusion, which I have a problem with because that almost relegates IBS as an afterthought rather than one of the primary diagnoses that you can think of, right? Because, if you're a poor IBS patient who's got classic symptoms of IBS, and I say the word classic with emphasis because there can be so many symptoms, that a constellation of symptoms someone can have. But, we do have diagnostic criteria for IBS, the Rome criteria. However, that old school way of thinking that it's a diagnosis of exclusion basically then subjects a patient with potential IBS to a gamut of unnecessary tests potentially that maybe they don't need.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're really waiting to have that one test that we can just say, okay, have this one test and then off you go for with IBS. But I think a lot of people with IBS, they also feel like the doctor is stabbing in the dark, or they're like, oh, we can't find anything else, so we'll give you this diagnosis. But actually, there is no specific marker, unfortunately, for IBS as a problem because it's a functional condition. But I do see people being misdiagnosed also, and they actually don't fit this very specific, as you mentioned, Rome criteria. So it is very specific. There's also many, or multiple in any country you're in, there's multiple guidelines about how we diagnose this. So it's not just, we'll do some random test and see what we come up with. It is a very structured process in terms of getting that diagnosis. And so even if those tests come back negative, doesn't necessarily mean you have IBS. You also have to fit that criteria. So it is very much structured and understood as a real condition.
I think in a really, unfortunate way, IBS is overdiagnosed in the wrong people, and it's underdiagnosed also, in the wrong people as well, because IBS on its own is a terrible life-changing condition for many people, but it's also associated with other conditions, other, women's health conditions, endometriosis, PCOS. People with conditions like that may have a higher prevalence of GI conditions like IBS potentially. But also there are other things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, acid reflux, which share some symptomatology with IBS. And a lot of people with true IBS are maybe misdiagnosed as, those two other things and many other things as well. And people with those things are then, overdiagnosed with IBS when it actually may be something else. So all of these conditions share, most gut conditions, chronic gut conditions, which aren't life-threatening, but quality of life deteriorating, have these sort of very common denominator symptoms, right? Where it could be excessive bloating after meals, irregularities with bowels, chronic low-grade pain, which kind of waxes and wanes, general kind of like microbiome disturbances as well, which we can't quite, put a pin on. And the unfortunate reality is, because all of those tests that I've just outlined also don't have amazing diagnostic tests, we're almost in this sort of weird phase where all of those things are bucketed together as one functional gut problem. And it's almost like, okay, that we don't know what to do with this. You've just got this and you've got to deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing this in clinic as dietitians. You would expect a dietitian to just do diet, of course. And obviously, we are not seeing that, unfortunately. In IBS clinics, we're seeing the bile acid diarrhea coming through, microscopic colitis, endometriosis, lots of conditions. And I think IBS is, to some extent, in the medical world, not really taken seriously. So once someone's typically seen that GP, where they've had those first line tests, they're put into that, IBS is nothing else, because no other test is then, maybe indicated at times, to be fair. They're then put into this bucket of IBS, but actually they have these other conditions and they can go on for many years and end up with other problems. So by the time they get around to seeing a medically trained dietitian, it's actually quite a messy picture, to be honest. And you end up having to navigate through trying to get them a proper diagnosis, right medications. So it is very tricky. And often by that time, even though they do have an underlying condition, whether be it endometriosis or bile acid diarrhea or celiac, etc., they almost have like the secondary IBS on top of it by that time, because they've had such a disruptive gut for many years. So it is very tricky to sort of navigate at that point. But I do think in the future we might even get maybe more, subsections of IBS that were, all along IBS wasn't that common. There's actually a lot of people out there that they have other things going on.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting thread to pull on. So maybe it would be worthwhile us just talking about the different types of IBS that exist that we know of right now.
The different types, it's pretty simple in a way. And I feel like some people, just a heads up before I go into this, they do kind of focus on this maybe too much. But it's within the Rome criteria, the criteria mentioned already, which classifies IBS. But you've basically got it based on symptoms. You've got constipation dominant, diarrhea dominant, mixed type, which is where your symptoms go between the two, and then unclassified, where you don't really fit a picture of any of them. There's a bit kind of more of a messy picture. Now, having said that, a lot of people, a lot of the foundations of IBS, which I'm sure we'll get into later, are actually really similar regardless of what type of IBS you've got. And I think some people are too like, oh, we must just focus on one type, whereas actually a lot of the foundations of gut function are very, very similar. And there are a few differences, but yeah, they're the 4 main types for now. We'll see if further research comes out in the future.
Yeah, so basically IBS-C, as you mentioned, more constipation-driven, IBS-D, diarrhea-driven, the mixed type, and then unclassified. I wonder, based on the conversation we just had, if in the future, if we do find a test or a blood test or a scan or something, some physiological marker that could help us identify and track IBS, I wonder if that then further splits into further subclassifications, or potentially we find that maybe some types of IBS as we know it now should be classified under a new category of, brain gut disorders, which are, quite significantly different on a physiological basis from what we understand now as IBS. But that's all hypothesis. When it comes to, you mentioned that even though there are these different types of IBS, there are some common denominator symptoms, but also management strategies that we can apply to this. One of the most popularized dietary interventions is the low FODMAP diet. Could you tell me a little bit more, as a low FODMAP, fully trained low FODMAP dietitian, what that means to a patient?
So the low FODMAP diet, and it sounds really geeky, but it's true, is probably the most exciting thing to happen in dietetics in terms of IBS in the last 20 years when it comes to this, because it's so good for people with IBS. So if this is the first time you're hearing about it, really honestly look into this. But basically what FODMAP stands for is fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And what they are is basically the different types of carbohydrates, and they end up going into your stomach like all the other food does, then into the small bowel where some of them should be digested, but in IBS they're not. They end up in the large bowel where they meet lots of your good microbes a lot of the time, but this is where they create a lot of gas, bloating, they can draw in water, and interestingly they do this to a certain extent in everybody. But people with IBS, they're more sensitive to it. So they can end up causing a range of symptoms. So things like your excess gas, pain, bloating, loose stools. So those sorts of typical symptoms with that. And really what we want to do is identify by using the low FODMAP diet, which is around a period of around 4 weeks, where we avoid them or reduce them down if you're actually intolerant to any of them. So we typically get a patient to follow a low FODMAP diet, so not completely cutting it out, but just reducing it down, and then systematically reintroducing one at a time to find out which one they're intolerant to, and also how much can they have before they have symptoms. So you get really specific answers. So really exciting.
So what you outlined there, I think, is pretty key, because there's a wrong assumption that the low FODMAP diet is then a permanent way of life for many people, right? And what you've outlined there is that it's a graduated, phased response. So you identify, the most common culprits that would be considered highly fermentable, high FODMAP, or, gut symptom provoking foods, then reducing their quantity or eliminating them from the diet, keeping a food diary, and then a phased return in of certain things, similar to like how allergy testing potentially would be done, where you remove something for a period of time, slowly add some things back in to identify the culprit. Even given that, there's like certain nuances within that as well. Like something could be considered high FODMAP at a certain dose, but low FODMAP at another dose. I mean, again, hypothetically speaking, someone could have, in a low FODMAP diet, they could have half an apple a day, potentially. And maybe 2 apples a day is their limit, where actually if they're having 2 apples a day, that really causes problems. But maybe half an apple doesn't cause a problem. And apples are a high FODMAP food. And like the dose is key there as well, where things can be high or low depending on the actual dose or number. But also, people shouldn't necessarily think about low FODMAP is less nutritious in any way. You can get, really good quality fibers, polyphenols, and nutrient-rich foods, which are low FODMAP. It just means they are less likely to trigger symptoms in that individual.
Correct. And ironically, even though the diet is technically a restricted diet, most people we work with are actually restricting more because they have no idea what's causing their symptoms. So they're avoiding all these sorts of foods. And for instance, they might want to just avoid all fibers, for example, because they're so scared of that. And then we give them this lifeline of foods that we know cause the issue. And actually, even on the restriction phase, the diet's less restrictive. So
This is something I am ridiculously excited about, and I've been using it for a while now myself. We've all got wearables for our sleep, steps, heart rate, but the one thing we don't track, the thing that actually tells you more about your health than almost anything else, is your bathroom data. And that's why I joined the team at Throne Science. Throne is the world's first hands-free smart toilet platform that turns your everyday bathroom habits into real actionable health insights. It uses computer vision and sensors to analyze stool shape, color, consistency, frequency, even patterns like straining and time spent sitting on the toilet. And I've been helping to build out the science as well. No forbidden photos on your phone, no awkward Excel spreadsheets. You just do what you normally do, and Throne gives you trends that actually matter for your gut health, hydration, fiber intake, and even early warning signs you'd normally miss. If you want to be one of the early people to try this or just follow the journey, head to thronescience.com. That's thronescience.com. Trust me, it will be your gut's new best friend. So, given that it's technically meant to be a temporary diet where you just figure out what's the, real culprit. I mean, someone could realistically be on a low FODMAP diet for their whole life, because if you actually, do your research and look at the number of low FODMAP friendly foods that exist in the world, it's pretty endless. You can be pretty creative and you can get a mix of stuff with low FODMAP. So someone could be on a low FODMAP diet for the rest of their life if they wish to, without any significant detriment to their health, if they continue to get variety in. But how long typically should a low FODMAP diet last for in totality?
Yeah, so I'm just going to go back over that point actually in terms of no one's going to keel over and die from being on this diet for a long time, but there is actually research to show there is a negative impact from the low FODMAP diet on the microbiome because a lot of these foods, they're fermentable carbohydrates, fermentable fibers, which means that they're feeding your microbes. So actually there could potentially be some negative there, but how much? We don't know. And definitely there's maybe an increased risk sometimes of maybe calcium deficiency, for example, because we're cutting out a lot of calcium rich food. So there are some risks, but yeah, you can absolutely sort of get a balanced diet as well. But really, you should only be on the diet around 4 to 6 weeks maximum. It's really just to get those fermentable carbohydrates out of your system, because long term, what we want is we only want you to be avoided in the foods that you really need to be. And it's not just about symptoms, it's also about the mental relationship with food. A lot of people with IBS are actually really high risk of eating disorders or have an eating disorder. So we don't want them on this fully restricted diet. Food at the end of the day is not just nutrition, it's also very social. It's about, going to that wedding, that holiday. And what's the point of doing that when you can't eat anything? So it sounds good initially, because I think when you've got really bad symptoms of IBS, you just want to get IBS control. So you don't care what you need to eat or do to do that. But long term, imagine having that great control, but also being able to eat almost everything apart from those 1 or 2 food groups or foods. That would be much better.
Yeah, I think on that point of restrictive diets and eating disorders as well, a lot of eating disorders are born out of restrictive diets in the first place. Body image and bullying, mental health issues leading to disturbed relationships with food, then leading to eating disorders, then having an impact on the microbiome, and the vicious cycle continues. And I guess on the point of a long-term low FODMAP diet, depriving and starving the body and microbiome of other beneficial nutrients, that's obviously one case to be made, but also in itself could be a restrictive diet. But also the food is one component of IBS, right? I mean, you could have a structural issue with your gut lining that we maybe cannot specifically pinpoint, and that's causing some microbiome related disturbances, and that's causing problem. But also, as a gut-brain disorder, the eating disorder component or the mental health component also has a huge issue in a role to play in IBS. So if someone, has the low FODMAP diet, that on its own may not be the fix for IBS, because there's this whole other world of other things. So situational stress, life stress, the mental state, emotional state. And as we know, emotion and food are also closely linked. So getting that sort of brain part of the brain gut disorder under control is also, half the battle technically of IBS.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a multifactorial condition. And, I always famously say I've had a few clients who ignore everything I say, go on holiday and have no stress from that awful job that they've been experiencing. And I mean, I wouldn't recommend this, but I mean, they're drinking alcohol, they're having all the things that you'd expect to trigger symptoms, and they don't get any symptoms for those 2 weeks they're away. So it is very much multifactorial, and there's as many ways we can and should target, and diet is just one of them.
Is there any value that you've seen in your own clinical experience where, okay, there may be certain foods that trigger someone with IBS, but as we've seen in non-IBS patients, for example, those who are lactose intolerance, there is some emerging data and some, published data suggesting that low levels of lactose via kefir can actually entrain their gut and stimulate colonic adaptation in the bacteria, which could potentially either relieve partially or reverse symptoms of lactose intolerance with that graduated exposure to low levels of lactose, and allow the bacteria to become more efficient at digesting lactose and breaking it down. Is there something similar that could be done, or that you've seen in your own practice with IBS, where actually those same trigger foods at very low levels can continue to be given to the point where actually it's no longer a trigger anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. And we technically can't say there's a cure for IBS, but we are seeing people coming back saying that they don't have it anymore and they're eating all sorts of foods, And so I think it depends on the pathway. But for example, if you look at fructans, so things that are in wheat, bread, onions, garlic, which are really famously a big trigger for people with IBS, these foods are digested not by an enzyme, but by the gut microbiota. And so it makes sense if we create a lovely environment for that microbiota where that person is actually not dealing with anxiety every day and stress, and they're also being fed really well and they're slept really well, that microbiota over time will actually improve. And guess what? Suddenly they can start to eat these fructans again. And then the other thing is the hypersensitivity. So sometimes with my clients, they'll use things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or they'll look at stress management techniques in the day. And it could well be that even if there is a level of the digestion not going so well, their body isn't feeling it in the same way. So there's definitely ways to target that. And even looking at lactose intolerance, say for instance, how well they digest it actually doesn't change. They might have some undigested lactose in their gut, but if their gut is not as sensitive, so it's not feeling things, they might actually tolerate a certain level of lactose not being digested to a certain extent. So we're definitely seeing long term, after we have that phase of let's find out what your initial triggers are, let's get some really good practices in that are sustainable and realistic long term, that 6 months later, even a year later, we're having people email back saying, actually, it's almost like it's completely gone, within reason. They're not partying till 2 a.m. every day or anything like that, but they're really managing a really varied lifestyle and diet without any real problems.
Yeah, I mean, the low FODMAP diet has obviously, it's been popularized because of its association with IBS, but I've now come across a couple of review articles looking at the positive impacts, albeit in small numbers of participants, of the low FODMAP diet in improving the GI symptoms of conditions like endometriosis. Now, it's difficult to say why exactly this works. Is there a component of IBS-like symptoms in endometriosis? Is there, a microbiome or, gut-driven component of endometriosis for which this low FODMAP diet seems to relieve bloating and gas symptoms? Or, is there something else there? I mean, all roads lead to this sort of microbiome overlap potentially. But it was interesting to note that low FODMAP diet seems to work in other disease cohorts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is really beneficial. So we do see people with endometriosis as well, and they come in and actually improve their symptoms. But interestingly, we're then maybe seeing someone get delayed in diagnosis as well, because they're going in with those IBS symptoms, they're getting missed having endometriosis and given the famous, here's a printout of the low FODMAP diet, and they're like, wow, my symptoms are better, I must have IBS. It kind of just prolongs that. But no, it's really interesting, to be honest. And even in other functional bowel problems where someone experiencing bloating and we don't know why, or looser stools and things like this, it can still be really quite beneficial. And we even sometimes seen it reverse where someone's got things like inflammatory bowel disease. So the low FODMAP diet doesn't help put somebody into remission in inflammatory bowel disease, but there is cases where someone is in remission in that inflammatory condition, but they're getting GI symptoms probably because their gut's been so disrupted, and then the low FODMAP diet can help. So in any kind of scenario where the gut is disrupted, it could be of benefit.
Yeah, and again, this is something that where I've gone deeper into the microbiome research, and it just provokes some thoughts within me and like some, hypotheses. And if you look back at the diet that maybe we used to have decades ago and hundreds of years ago, when we used to have a greater quantity of roots, root vegetables, tubers, and slower fermenting plant food in our diet compared to now, where we have more of the fast digesting, fast fermenting fibers. And this is something I didn't appreciate, in my clinical days. But if you look at the colon, and you can sort of divide the colon into three parts, right? You've got the first part of the colon, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the middle part, and then the last part, which is the descending colon. The greatest diversity and concentration of gut bacteria live in the descending colon and rectum. And most of the foods that we eat right now are digested and fermented in the first and early part of the middle colon, where actually it's feeding not the bulk of the bacteria which live at the end. It's feeding kind of like the early dwellers. And because it's so fast fermenting, you get rapid gas and bloating with the types of foods that we typically consume now. Like, apple's great, but an apple is a fast fermenting fiber source. And the way the apple is now is far different to how an apple would have looked decades ago, or even hundreds of years ago. And then slower fermenting fibers like corn, wheat, beans, these sort of potatoes like cassava, really root vegetables and tubers like that, which, I would say in most diets these days, it's not really a huge part of the diet. But those are the slower fermenting fibers which go and make it to the end. And as they're slow fermenting, they still have this really potent fiber source and are a rich source of prebiotics. But because they ferment so slowly, it doesn't trigger symptoms as much as an apple would, or, like a pear would, or something like that. And I just wonder if that dietary change over decades has also been somewhat linked to an increased incidence in gut symptoms, IBS, and things like that.
Yeah, potentially. And I think without sort of, making this really boring, like we're never really going to know is there's lots of changes. And I think that's the problem with the gut is that there's a diet, lifestyle, pollution changes, mental health issues are on the rise. We could also argue there's better diagnosis as well. There's there's a multitude of things it could be. And it could even be, our diets from our parents before, even when we are in the womb, could be impacting how things are, and things like we're not in contact with soil as much, as kids used to like be running around the farms and things like that. And that's not, there's so many different things, but definitely diet changes, even from, I'm only 36 now, from when we were kids, the amount of processed food that's coming in is, it's astonishing. And people are really confused about what's got the better fibers in it, and the variety's gone. And it is really, really a tricky area indeed.
One thing I'm really interested in, I'm seeing a lot more of and seeing the associations between these two worlds colliding, is women's health and IBS. Women are disproportionately more affected by IBS and gut issues than men are. To the tune of, women have twice the incidence of IBS than men do. What is the overlap between IBS and women's health? Because even in the perimenopause and menopause stage, you do get more IBS type symptoms as well.
Yeah, we don't get it easy as women, I'll tell you that with this. But yeah, there's a massive crossover with being female, unfortunately. So you literally double the amount of diagnosis. So we don't, again, in IBS, surprise, we don't exactly, but it's potentially hormone related, specifically towards estrogen, because we see that IBS is not very common in children. It seems to be in adults. So therefore, when we're having these menstrual cycle hormonal changes, interestingly during perimenopause, and I looked this up when I was writing my book to see, that surely there's some research, but there isn't, to see if IBS rates increase. But there's some that show it does, some that doesn't. It's a little bit of a grey area. But interestingly, when we hit menopause, the rates of new IBS diagnosis drop off, suggesting there's that link to estrogen potentially. But if you are sort of menopausal age or older and have IBS, unfortunately, symptoms seem to be far worse. So there is definitely this connection. And it seems to fluctuate throughout the cycle, throughout a woman's cycle, with hormones changing with that. So yeah, and there's other little links as well, potentially, that are interesting to explore in this, is looking at the mental health rate. So we know that women are more likely to have a mental health disorder. We know that women are more likely to have things like insomnia. So we know these are linked to the gut function as well. So it's not a clear, it's only periods, or it's only perimenopause. And then interestingly, even in pregnancy, our guts get affected, but we don't have any specific patterns towards IBS in that. I mean, I have clients who get pregnant and through their pregnancy symptoms are actually much better. But we know that at every stage, essentially where hormones are changing, it does cause issues, and whether it's slowing the gut down, speeding it up, to do with the microbiota. So even if you look at, we're talking about microbiota a lot today, in perimenopause and then towards menopause, the diversity levels of your microbes really drop and they start to change as well. So potentially that could be an issue. Whereas with men or males, they tend to be a little bit more stable throughout their lifespan. And in that sense, they have a little bit easier, I think, when it comes to IBS.
Yeah, it does seem like, based on everything that we know, that estrogen seems to be the culprit that's across the board. Even if you look at PCOS, endometriosis, and other estrogen dominant women's health conditions where they have higher rates of GI symptoms which overlap with IBS and a higher incidence of IBS. And also perimenopause, where often the symptomatology is a lot worse and a lot more chaotic than menopause, where the estrogen drops off and stabilizes more so than in the peri stage. Yeah, so it seems truly that, given that, but also the fact that the gut lining has estrogen receptors, also seems to stand to reason that, it has a significant role to play in GI contractions, motility symptoms. So they're clearly there. And interesting you notice about the pregnancy stage. Pregnancy is such a unique stage compared to all these other life stages in a woman's life. And, I guess we need some more evidence here, but, there is something to be said about the connection between, or the sort of microchimerism, the cell transfer between the fetus and the mother, where there is some injury, low-grade injuries, which can be improved by the fetus. Fetal cells, which are often stem cells, providing some regenerative help to the mother. So I wonder whether there is, you mentioned that you saw an improvement in your IBS symptoms during pregnancy. Is that somehow fetal driven? Are there some stem cells which are produced in response to the state of pregnancy, so that, almost selfishly, the fetus is like, hey, I need my mother to be as healthy as possible. Let me help her.
Yeah, interesting. And I would love to see that research, but there's so much more we could be doing, especially in women's health, which is, I feel like it's been let down a little bit by the research side of things, but we definitely need to find out more information to see what we can do.
Only 5% of us are feeding our guts properly. That means 95% of us are accidentally starving our microbiomes, and we feel it through bloating, sluggish digestion, and other symptoms and health challenges. That's why I created Loam, a 6-in-1 prebiotic fiber blend designed to cultivate a nourished, thriving gut. Each serving delivers 10 grams of plant-based fibers, making it that much easier to feed the gut bacteria that fuel your digestion, immune system, metabolism, mood, and more. And the best part is it's completely invisible. No taste, no texture, no grit. Loam dissolves into anything and literally disappears into your day. If you want your whole health to thrive, start by feeding the ecosystem that runs the show. Head to www.loamscience.com to try Loam. And exclusively for you, just because you're listening to this podcast, get an additional 10% off with the code POD10. Again, that's POD10 to try Loam and get an additional 10% off. Loam, health grows here. What are some, beyond diet, some typical things that you'd advise someone with IBS to just manage on their own on a day-to-day life?
Great question, because I feel like with IBS it often gets overcomplicated, doesn't it? In terms of there's so many things you could do and you need professional support with, etc. But there's things that we can be doing in our day-to-day life. So when I work with clients, there's 4 fundamentals really you need to look at: sleep, movement, mental health, and then also nutrition. Now, there's elements of that you will need professional support with. And obviously things like mental health, there's a huge variety of, how poor is someone's mental health. But there's what I call low-hanging fruit. So for example, with mental health side of things, somebody doing meditation, you can download one of those apps. A lot of these things are free even, and just do 10 minutes per day. And we know that that will improve how your body reacts to stress and anxiety. Therefore, it's less likely to trigger off an IBS response. Looking at your diet, for example, often we know that we should be eating 30 grams of fiber per day, but if someone is having a particularly low intake, that could actually in itself just be triggering symptoms to the point where some people might not even have IBS. They might just have a really low fiber intake. Or sleep. So many people are obsessed with things like supplements, medications, the next cool thing as such. But actually just getting a consistent 8 hours sleep per night, and I know it's not always easy, we're not going to leave the party really early necessarily, but getting a consistent 8 hours sleep per night can make a huge difference in how the gut functions the next day. It can increase our threshold towards stress and anxiety as well. So that means you can go about that stressful, maybe work situation that you can't change, but actually then not get triggered. So there's lots of things you can try, and I'd say don't try them all at once because it becomes unsustainable, and consistency is really key. But maybe keep a diary for a week and look to see what is it out of that nutrition, sleep, movement, and mental health that's really the big factor in your life, and see what little goal you can make. So it could just be, right, I'm just going to do meditation every single day for 10 minutes per day. That's it. And then from there, you can make small changes that honestly make a huge difference.
You obviously mentioned there about supplements. One thing which we know, there's a whole range of supplements which may cause problems in those with IBS. For example, in my own research in this area, in the fiber supplement world, there are lots of fiber supplements which have things like inulin and fructooligosaccharides, which are, high FODMAP fibers, which may provoke IBS symptoms in many people. Even probiotics, even though we know that there is a category of certain types of probiotic strains which may be studied for specific subtypes of IBS for bloating symptoms or whatnot. Again, reckless use of probiotics that haven't been properly studied could worsen symptoms of IBS. And same can be made of so many supplements. So, if you had someone coming to you saying, hey, I want some good quality supplements that I could go and buy specifically for IBS that I could explore, what would they be top of mind?
Yeah, so top of mind is going to be my favorite one, which is fiber supplements. So fiber supplements, people again are scared of it because it's fiber, and a lot of people with IBS will experience that fiber makes symptoms worse. The fiber supplements like psyllium husk or guar gum, which are particularly low fermenting, are really good at doing things like bulking up the stool, which is really good regardless of whether you have loose stools, constipation. They're really cheap as well, and they're not necessarily expensive. Not very palatable, I have to say, but they're easy to get into a diet without having to change too much in there. The other one's things like vitamin D. We know that there's a huge issue with vitamin D deficiency across even people that don't have IBS, but there are some links to vitamin D deficiency and IBS worsening. So that's something you could maybe explore, even getting tested and just corrected for yourself as well. Peppermint oil capsules is another one. Again, very easy to just buy over the counter, and what they'll do is block pain. And this is a bit of an antispasmodic as well, very natural, but you have them around 20 minutes before a meal. Again, this is a low hanging fruit as such, just to get into your routine. And so those are the main ones. Probiotics sometimes, but I have to be honest, I don't use them for all of my clients. I find that those ones are the main ones, which are not very exciting, but they work. They work really, really well. And then it comes down to sort of diet and lifestyle with those.
Yeah, I think, with probiotics, it's definitely increasing the price point, but then the risk benefit ratio becomes a bit more skewed because there is a risk if you get the wrong stuff, or if it doesn't work, you've just wasted money. But the other things you mentioned, the fiber, the vitamin D, the lifestyle stuff, there's almost no risk with that. I don't think I've ever had a problem. I don't have IBS, but, in my history of taking psyllium husk, I've never experienced any problems. Same can be said with vitamin D. I still take vitamin D to this day. I've never had a problem with vitamin D. What is your view on certain anti-gas medications, things like simethicone, which people can use to reduce the flatulence? Again, is that overkill? Is there any evidence or benefit you've seen in your patient population?
So there's some, I guess, there's more theory. The evidence isn't great, but what it is there's a whole range of different supplements in it that contain it. But the issue with simethicone, what it does is it basically traps little air pockets in the gut that might cause pain, discomfort, bloating, and it makes them into sort of bigger air pockets that are easier to get rid of, essentially. So it gets rid of your trapped gas. Now, so there's not very much harm in taking it, even if it didn't work. So what I would say to somebody is you may as well try it. But I am seeing people where it doesn't really work for them. And actually, interesting in the research in IBS specifically, which we need to be careful about because there's a lot of gut health research, but not much specifically in IBS. this active ingredient that we're talking about is usually paired up with something else. So we're not really sure whether it was the something else that's caused the improvements or the gas product that we're looking at. And that's one of the issues in research and IBS in general. But sometimes it does get to the point, if I've got somebody and if someone's listening to this and they're in a lot of pain, a lot of discomfort, why not try it? Really, there's no harm. And again, these are relatively cheap. They're not too expensive, these types of supplements.
We've spoken a lot about the role of diet in IBS. Are there any, unsuspecting or surprising food choices that could cause IBS flare-ups in some people?
Yeah, quite a few. Little things like chia seed is always one, which always surprises people because it's normally one that people go to because it's really high in fiber. It doesn't have any spices or herbs or anything fancy. It's easy to put onto cereal. So people often add it in a way of trying to improve their gut function. But it's got what we call a very high viscosity. So it gets very, very gloopy. And if you've got a particularly slow gut, it can actually worsen constipation. So again, most people with IBS eventually can tolerate it to a certain extent, but it's definitely something I wouldn't go and, add in straight away with that one. So fermented foods would be another one. So fermented foods are great to have in the diet. There's lots of benefits health-wise and gut-wise as well, but they're not the same as having a specific probiotic. And a lot of the fermented foods are really high in FODMAP, so people are adding them diligently, like 3 times a day, trying to help their IBS, but actually it's creating more gas, more bloating, more pain. So that would be the sort of 2 biggest ones that I'm seeing that people, unfortunately, are adding actually to improve their IBS, but it's backfiring really.
So if there was someone who was trying to figure out what was causing their IBS-like symptoms, what would be a simple checklist that you could advise for them to do by themselves at home?
So first of all, I'd say to you, just keep a diary. And when I say keep a diary, I do not want anyone taking away the fact that they're going to go and keep a diary to see what foods are going to trigger you, because the foods will trigger you depending on how much of that food you've eaten, what you had in combination with, where you were stressed that day and not stressed. And other lifestyle factors. So if you keep a diary just to see, was it gluten? Was it onions, garlic? You will end up a few months from now with nothing in your diet because you'll go, I had a symptom then, I'll take that food out, But where a diary can be really useful for is going back to those 4 key foundations I was talking about: the sleep, the movement, the mental health, and then just general nutrition in terms of fiber. Are you eating regularly and drinking enough fluid? So if you keep a diary for a week, don't change anything, then it will give you an idea of what you need to target. And from there, you just need to look at those core foundations. So around nutrition, looking at things like fiber intake, fluid. Are you eating 3 regular meals per day? Is half the plate vegetables? Are we eating enough as well? So check you're not losing weight, you're not cutting back. That in itself can cause a lot of symptoms. Are you drinking enough fluid? And then having a look at mental health side of things. And even with mental health, sometimes I think people say, I'm not stressed, I'm not that anxious, but then they're drinking maybe 4 litres of water a day because their mouth is always dry, which is a sign of anxiety and stress. And actually then they could put in some meditation for that. So just start by looking at what is your actual routine. Is there some sort of low-hanging fruit that you can put into your routine?
I think the whole topic of IBS is fascinating, and you cover it so well because if we break the brain and gut into 2 separate parts, people with mental health conditions like depression are more likely to have dysbiotic guts. People with dysbiotic guts or a chronic gut problem are more likely to have superadded mental health issues, whether it's depression, anxiety, or a greater risk of those things. And then when you combine them together, that is literally the collision of the brain and gut disorders, where you've got things like IBS, where you may be, leaning one side or more. There could be someone with IBS who has more brain symptoms than gut symptoms, and vice versa. And I just think it's such a fascinating topic. It also, shows how little we know about it. Like, we've had this very in-depth conversation where you've given me so much knowledge, but I feel there's a lot more to go. So, Kirsten, thank you so much for sharing so much. And I think we need to bring you on another time to cover a lot of what we haven't covered.
Thank you so much for having me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to the channel if you've taken anything away from today's conversation. If you want to learn more about Loam Science and the novel 6-in-1 prebiotic fiber, you can go to loamscience.com. And remember, if you'd like to find out even more about Throne and their incredible new smart toilet device, go to thronescience.com.